Well, Miss Beach, this visit to Ireland for the Joyce celebrations must have brought you back in memory over a great many highlights of your life. Perhaps you'd like to tell us something about them.
Yes, this great event in this James Joyce Tower opening brings me back to the days in 1922 when I published Ulysses by James Joyce in my little bookshop called Shakespeare and Company in Paris.
Yes.
I started life in a Presbyterian parsonage in Princeton, New Jersey, where my father was the Presbyterian pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. And we lived in a street called Library Place. And in the pews of my father's church, you'd see an ex-president and his family, Grover Cleveland, and a future president and his family, Woodrow Wilson. I left Princeton and went to Paris during the war, the First World War. And I was studying in Paris and teaching a little too. And I used to frequent a bookshop of a French friend of mine named Adrien Monnier, called the House of the Friends of Books. And there I met all the French writers, and I knew them before I ever had a bookshop of my own. And it was my French friend, Adrien Monnier, who encouraged me to open a bookshop in Paris. And I really was not prepared for such a thing at all. I knew nothing about business and a little about books, and I only loved books very much. And I couldn't really foresee the success of this place and how its life would be eventually. I didn't imagine such a thing as having a James Joyce frequenting it, going in and out the door, nor Hemingway, nor any of those people, but they were hardly anywhere to be seen at that time. Well, I opened my bookshop, and already I had all these young Americans who were pouring into Paris from America, and they were disgusted in America because they couldn't get drink. It was prohibition, and they couldn't get Ulysses. I used to think those were the two causes of their discontent. They were thoroughly frustrated, and of course Ulysses was the work that they were all they admired the most. And think how annoying not to be able to get it anymore. And it was being suppressed in a review called The Little Review. And two women there, it was always women who were publishing Joyce, and they were trying to publish this thing, and it was suppressed. And finally their review was suppressed, and they were hauled off to prison for it.
Well,
all on account of Joyce.
Suddenly you, from being a bookseller, a very famous bookseller, you suddenly decided to go into publishing.
Yes. You see, I met Joyce one day at a party that I wasn't supposed to attend at all, as I wasn't invited. But Adrien Monnier took me, and it was the house of a French poet named André Spear, who was a friend of Ezra Pound's. And Ezra Pound had just lured Joyce and his family to Paris, and he had him invited to this party, and so we were really, both of us, uninvited. And when I got there, the host, André Spear, whispered in my ear, the Irish writer James Joyce is here. So you see, he must have known already the importance of James Joyce. And I was so frightened, so scared, and I imagined Joyce up in the clouds somewhere with the gods, you see. I never thought I could meet him in the flesh, and it seemed terribly frightening, and I thought at first I would run home, but I didn't. I stayed, and I met Joyce, and Mrs. Joyce was there. I met Nora Joyce and liked her very much. And Joyce was sitting at table, and Ezra Pound was teasing him with putting all the wine bottles and all the glasses in front of his place, and he wasn't drinking a drop. And this was because he had vowed not to drink until night time. But Ezra knew this. Nobody else could understand the point of that joke. And after lunch, when they were discussing all kinds of problems in French writing, I went into a room off the dining room where André Spear had a lot of books piled up. It was his little library. And leaning in the corner against the bookshelves was James Joyce, drooping. And I went up to him boldly and spoke to him, and we had a conversation together. And he seemed very much interested in my bookshop. He said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I have a bookshop." "Oh, what have you? Give me the address." And I told him it's Shakespeare and Company, and it's 8 Rue du Puitrin, Paris 6. And he took this all down, peering very close at it because his eyes were not good. And I was very much impressed with Joyce. I thought I'd never seen anyone so interesting and so fine. He seemed very sensitive, terribly, and very, very interesting. And some people asked me, "Were you disappointed when you met James Joyce?" And I always say, never at all, for he was anything but disappointing.
And then he brought along the manuscript, the typescript of Ulysses to you.
Yes. Well, he used to tell me about what was going on in New York, and he was following this case where the Ulysses was being suppressed. And finally he came one day to show me this little review, and he said, "You see, this is now being completely suppressed, and my book, as he pronounced it, will never come out." So he sat there with his head in his hands, and I said to him, "Would you like me to publish Ulysses?" And he said, "I would." He seemed very much relieved, in fact. Why, I don't know, because it wouldn't inspire confidence in anyone who had such a book that he'd taken 7 years to write, to give it into the hands of someone so inexperienced and young and just a kind of a little bookshop, not a publishing house at all. And this Ulysses might have been in a great publishing house, you know, in the great star of it. But Joyce was not afraid of that at all, and he considered that what he did made the importance, you see. So that's the way I started publishing Ulysses. And then Joyce, who had begun by being a member of my library and taking out Riders to the Sea, that was the first book he borrowed, he began to frequent the bookshop like all these other people who had adopted it as their headquarters. And Hemingway and all the young writers used to practically live in my bookshop. I could hardly get any work done. And they had their publishing houses, what they called publishing houses, and their reviews, and they were all going on at that time, and I was the sort of mother hen of that, as one of the American newspaper writers called me, mother hen of the 20s. And I took care of all those things, and Joyce too. And they seemed to come to me about everything. And I met Ernest Hemingway when he came from the wars in Italy, where he was very badly wounded. And he had still the scars on his leg and his foot were not even healed by that time. And he came into my shop, and he had an introduction from Sherwood Anderson, but he didn't give that. He'd forgotten to bring it, and he didn't need it because I thought he was so interesting. And he said, "Would you like to see my wounds?" And I said, "Yes, indeed." And he took off his shoe and his sock and showed me all these dreadful scars on his leg and foot. And then we became great friends, and he didn't like it because Adrienne Monnier and I, who were booksellers, he thought we didn't follow the sport events enough. And he was a sports writer for the Toronto Star, and that was his business. But we didn't know anything about boxing and cycling and such things, so he initiated us into those things. And thanks to Hemingway that we learned all about that, and I got very interested in boxing. And I organized a boxing match between Ernest Hemingway and a young writer named Jean Prévost, who used to come to see us a great deal. And they had a fight, but they wouldn't let me come to it. I don't know why.
Who won?
Ernest Hemingway broke his thumb against the head of this fellow who had a very hard head. He used to bang his head against an iron pipe in my shop, and the iron pipe used to shudder, but not this fellow. And this fellow was killed in the resistance. I'd like you to know that, because he was very afraid of a sore throat or a frog in his throat or a little pain anywhere, but he wasn't afraid of the resistance, and he was shot by the Germans.
Well, right through the late 20s and right up to the middle 30s, certainly you had, I should think, practically every internationally known writer, French,
yes.
English, Irish.
Yes, we had I used to know the Irish writers when they came to Paris. They always looked me up. And one of the first was Austin Clarke. I used to know him when he was a very young poet and he landed in Paris. And he told me about a vision he had at Notre Dame, and I'm sorry to say I'll have to ask him what this vision was. He must remind me of it. I thought he was very much of a poet, very Irish, and I had his poems immediately. I always had all the Irish poems. And I used to have Beckett, Samuel Beckett, from the very beginning. When no one was reading him in English, I had all his books in English. You know, things like More Pricks Than Kicks. I used to love the title of that book. And all those things. I knew Beckett. And Beckett was a great friend of Joyce's. He used to frequent, and he belonged to our crowd, as we called it. Joyce was the great star of the crowd, and we had this crowd. And Scott Fitzgerald came in and out and was in this crowd. John Dos Passos was another one. And Thornton Wilder was another. We knew all the young American writers at that time because they were all abroad. And the mixing with this were the great French writers of the time and the younger ones too. The surrealists, we knew them too. And a great friend of mine was this Louis Aragon, who's now very active in the Communist Party, but that doesn't, that's come between us. I mean, he doesn't seek me out as he used to, but in those days he used to come and recite his poems to me in the bookshop. And he used to recite a poem called La Table, the table, and there was nothing in this poem but the table. The table, the table, the table, the table, the table. And then he had another poem called The Alphabet. He said, you must hear my poem, The Alphabet. And it was A, B, C, and this went on, the whole alphabet.
How did these various writers get on with Joyce personally?
Oh, wonderfully. Joyce was a great mixer. People think that he must have been aloof and such a great man and all that. He was never at all standoffish and used to talk with everyone and be very nice, and he was a great favorite with everybody he met. And they used to besiege him at this restaurant. He was never allowed any peace at the restaurant that he went to opposite the Gare Montparnasse, because they used to come there and bring a book for him to sign, and people used to come and crowd the tables just to look at him while he was having his dinner, which was very disturbing for the poor Joyce family, the whole family.
Well, you maintained the bookshop up till 1939, 1940.
Yes, all these things went on in the bookshop. We had a very interesting time. I gave a Walt Whitman exhibition, and Walt Whitman was not the fashion at all in my young 20s by young American writers. They couldn't bear him, and T.S. Eliot didn't like him, and they thought then they had to follow what Eliot said. But I liked Walt Whitman. I possessed some manuscripts that were in my family, and with those as the base, I gave an exhibition of Walt Whitman, and I soon found out that Joyce liked Walt Whitman, and that was a facer for these young Americans. I didn't know what to think of that. And Joyce would recite Walt Whitman to me in my bookshop. And I gave this exhibition, and I have the book in which they all signed, and there's James Joyce's name, and Paul Valéry, and all these people, and Ernest Hemingway, and all the young crowd were all on this thing. And after that, you know, I had there, and then Adrien Monier's great event was bringing out Ulysses in French. And we had that, something going on all the time with Joyce. We had always Joyce in activities. And my bookshop they began to look on it as a Joyce workshop.
Yes.
And then I met the Eugene Jolas and his wife, who started a review called Transition. And it's very important to note this, because they're very important in the life of Joyce's writings. They published almost entirely Finnegan's Wake in their magazine. One day Eugene Jolas came to tell me that he was leaving the Chicago Tribune, where he was a writer, and that he was starting a review called Transition. And he said, can you suggest anything interesting we could have? Well, I said, well, there's James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It was called Work in Progress at that time. And I said, you must ask James Joyce for this thing, because it was just appearing in pieces everywhere. And I said, it's time for this to appear as a serial and in your magazine. Why don't you ask him? So they asked Joyce, and then they began to publish Finnegan's Wake. Yeah. And they were great friends to Joyce in his life in Paris.
And when the war came, Miss Beach, you decided to remain in Paris.
Yes, I decided then to stay in Paris, although the Germans were coming fast. They were getting nearer and nearer, and Paris was emptied of the Parisians. None were left hardly, and packs of dogs were running through the streets, wild, hungry dogs. And the Parisians fled. I saw them passing Shakespeare and Company, and were on foot, and they were all walking all over France. They didn't know where they were going, retreating, and the Germans were coming in. And Adrienne Monnier and I went to see them coming in, and the tears were streaming down our cheeks. And it was a very, very awful experience, horrible. And then we stayed on, and the Germans, of course, didn't like me, but I kept my shop open for a while until a German officer came in, and he said, I want that copy of Finnegan's Wake you've got in the window. Well, I said, that's the only copy left in Paris, and you can't have it. And I said, you don't understand that anyhow. You don't know Joyce. And he said, oh, but we admire James Joyce very much in Germany. And he was very angry, and he went out and got into his great car, his great military car, surrounded with other fellows in helmets, and drove away. Then he came back again in about 10 days, and he said, your copy of Finnegan's Wake is gone from the window. What did you do with it? And I said, I've put it away. It's for me. And he was so furious. He said, well, you know, we're coming this afternoon to confiscate all your goods. Well, I said, very well, do so. And he said, now will you sell Finnegan's Wake? And I said, not at all, come along. So he disappeared in a rage, booming down the street. The only people that had cars in Paris were the Germans. And I immediately had everything removed from our shop. In about 2 hours, there wasn't a book left in it. Not only Finnegan's Wake, but everything else disappeared. And the concierge told me to put everything in an empty apartment in that house. So we piled up the stairs with all these things in clothes baskets. Everybody, all my friends came rushing to the rescue. All my French friends, they were the ones who were left. And we hid everything upstairs. And when the Germans came that afternoon, I peered out the windows that were all shuttered up. And I had the name of Shakespeare and Company painted off the front by the house painters lived in the house, and the carpenters took down the shelves even. Everything was removed, and the shutters were up. So the Germans must have come, you know, and saw nothing left at all. And I retired upstairs.
Well, they came and brought you off later on.
Well, they kept track of me because I had to sign at the commissaries once a week as an enemy alien then. And we had come into the war, you see, and so I signed in a big book that they could never find. I used to find it for them, and I said, there it is, under there. And I'd sign in this book, and it said opposite my name, has no horse. Never knew why. And I think they were trying to trace the horses in France. And then the Gestapo kept track of me, and they'd come to see me all the time. And I knew someone in the Gestapo because I got Gordon Craig out of prison. I just happened to. I wasn't on good terms with these Germans, but they came to my shop before I closed and asked to look at my theatrical books, and I showed them all Gordon Craig's books. And they said, then I said, you know, it's a disgrace for you to have imprisoned Gordon Craig and his wife and little child. And so they said, oh, but we'll get him out. And they did get him out, so I was instrumental in that. And then after I closed, I just retired into this little room of mine, these little rooms above the shop, and the Gestapo would come and they'd say, you have a Jewish girl helping you had in the bookshop, and we have a black mark against you. And I said, okay. And then they said, well, we'll come for you, you know. And I said, well, okay. I always said okay to them. And then one day they did come. It was rather frightening, and they came with a big truck. And the soldier stood there with his tin plate around his neck and waited while I got ready and gave me very little time to go off as a prisoner. And I went down accompanied by these soldiers, and they hustled me onto a truck and took me off with other American friends in this same truck that I knew. And every time we stopped at the house of an American to pick up another American for their old camp, and they'd go inside, then they'd come out and shake their heads. They hadn't found this person, they'd fled, and we used to cheer loudly. And then they drove us. We didn't know, we couldn't see where we were going. But when we got there, we found we were in the zoo, out in the Jardin d'Acclimatation.
How long did you spend there?
Well, we spent 10 days in the zoo in what we called the monkey house. And in this monkey house, we were all in a big room, of over 200 American women, and on these cot beds with water dripping from the roof. And the Germans were up on this gallery above, and they were checking us all the time. All night long, they would flash the light on our faces to count us, and they went around counting us, and we were never the same number. And they found us a great bore. And then they took us out to a camp. We didn't know where we were going in these awful old trains, stuffed with what this American friend said were donkey's feathers. And we landed in this prison at Vittel, where we were kept. I stayed there only about 5 or 6 months, and then I was let out on sick leave. And I came back to Paris and hid for fear they'd think I was well enough to go back. I was hid in a student's home, and they never nobody let on that I was there. And then I used to go back and forth in the streets while the liberation was going on, and they were shooting at us in the streets. And my friend and I, Adrien Monnier, went out one day because we heard they were leaving, that the enemy was leaving us, and that it was in the Boule Miche next to us. The Boulevard Saint-Michel was just a few steps away. And we went out there, and everybody was cheering, and the Germans were retiring with all their mechanized forces down the street. And they got so angry because people seemed so happy and waving WC brushes that they began to shoot their machine guns along the sidewalk and swept along, and my friend and I had to lie down on our stomachs and stay there until this was over.
Well, shortly
When we
after,
raised our heads, we saw the stretchers taking away wounded people.
well, shortly after that, you were in fact liberated yourself. weren't you?
Well, then after that, we were liberated by Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was the first American that we saw, that we knew, who arrived in Paris. He arrived with the first ones with General Leclerc. I heard a noise out in the street in the Rue de l'Odéon, and looked out the window, and I saw a string of jeeps with these men in them. And then I heard people calling and calling, Sylvia, Sylvia. And I heard this big voice saying, Sylvia, Sylvia. And it was Ernest Hemingway and his men. And I rushed down the stairs, and he picked me up, and swung me around and swung me around. And then everybody was looking out of the windows and so pleased, and they called out, and they cheered this thing too. And then I took him up to Adrien Monnier's apartment, and he sat down there with his clanking machine gun, and he was all bloody with a bloody battle dress. And we asked him what he would like us to do for him, and he said, soap, like some soap. And soap was very rare by that time, but Adrien got out her last piece of soap. And then he said, what can I do for you? And we said, oh, liberate us, because these enemy was still firing from the roofs, and the resistance was firing also from the roofs, and this shooting was going on all the time, day and night, and especially on Adrien Monnier's roof. So Ernest Hemingway said, oh yes, and he signaled to his men to come up and come up out of those jeeps. So he brought his men up, and they all went up on the roof, and we heard a great deal of shooting going on for a few minutes, and then the shooting stopped forever. We had no more shooting after that. Then we asked Ernest Hemingway if he wouldn't stay and have something with us, some drink, and he said, oh no, I have to liberate the cellar of the Ritz.
Well, that was 25 years after you had first met him in Paris. It was a long time, and we've come a long way round from
yes,
the tower and back again to it.
Yes, and now I'm back here and at this wonderful event that has made me so happy, the opening of the James Joyce's Tower.